Hello, class. My name is Michael Rust, and I wanted to take some time to talk to you about Denning's book and kind of cover how a specific topic discussed in that book has influenced me greatly over the time we've been in this class. Um, I'm going to do that by first introducing myself, talking about the specific theory I'm going to deal with, and then how that breaks down. And then I'm going to relate it to something that's happened in the last couple weeks for me, in particular, and kind of relate it all together, and hopefully come up with a pretty clear presentation of how this theory in particular has impacted me. So let me start off by introducing myself. My name is Michael Rust. I recently traveled across the country in a moving truck from the University of Texas El Paso, where I was the graduate assistant with women's volleyball, and am now back in my hometown of Hockessin, Delaware. I'm actually sitting in my parents' basement. You can see behind me in my dad's old office, and I am working with the University of Delaware women's volleyball team now, which is where I went to college, my undergraduate degree. So that's kind of my story. Now, I want to take a little bit of time to explain, and you'll see why as I go through my explanation of the theory, but I wanted to take a little bit of time to explain what has kind of happened over the last 3 weeks. And if you have read any of my posts, you probably have read a little bit about the fact that, like I said, I drove back from University of Texas El Paso. It was a 30-hour drive in a moving truck by myself. It was not a very fun experience, but I didn't know what I was coming home to. When I got back, I found out that my father, who has been sick for several years with Parkinson's disease, was in his final days. That he wasn't eating very much, he wasn't drinking very much, and in the midst of that, I was, finishing up this master's program, and I was in this class, and it was just a lot to have to deal with when I first got back. My father ended up passing away about almost 2 weeks ago, at the beginning of the week, or midweek, and we had his funeral a week ago yesterday. So you can imagine I've been playing some pretty crazy catch-up. But one of the things that stood out to me through my process of essentially leading my family through the hardest time in our lives was this concept that Denning discusses. And it's this idea of mastering the audience's story. And I want to explain to you first the concepts that I want to discuss specifically from that chapter, and then I'll tie it into how that relates to my father's death. So first off, there's 3 things that I want to talk about when referencing mastering your audience's story. The first one is the idea that managerial action is less effective than we realize. This idea of managers having preferential treatment, corner offices that are separate from maybe the cubicles or where people may be working, or the idea that they just kind of can bark orders, and that's accepted. It's not really understanding. There's no real connection between a manager and their employees. It's more about, this is my position, and you're going to do what needs to be done. A very kind of old school way of thinking. And for a lot of us, right, for me, I'm a coach. I was a high school English teacher. There's a lot of military people in this class. There's something familiar about that. This idea that, well, I'm the boss, or I'm the coach, or I'm the CO. Like, it makes sense to just say, you're going to do this because. But Denning explains that that's really not the world we live in anymore. That does work in some capacity, but it's really an old school way of thinking and doesn't necessarily always connect with, especially this new generation of young people that are entering the workforce, entering the military, or whatever it may be. The second concept I want to talk about is that audiences are more difficult than they used to be. And again, it falls in line with this idea that there's kind of a new line of thinking, a new way of thinking about how we interact with those that we're trying to guide or our followers. So the third and last thing is that leaders must understand their audience's story. And so what I'm going to do with those three concepts is kind of tie them into the idea, not the idea, but the fact that I had to give my father's eulogy at his funeral. So for those of you that might not be familiar with a eulogy, it's basically an opportunity for someone to speak about the life of the person you're honoring at a funeral service. And a lot of times it's, someone just gets up and might tell a story or two about the person, but I felt like I needed to approach it differently. And part of that came from right around the time that I started working and I agreed to give the eulogy. I had read through this chapter. And it may seem like a weird connection, but again, it's my reality right now, and it's the best way that I knew how to relate an experience to this book, because it's the only experience that I can really think about right now, because I'm still in the middle of it. So, like I said, the first thing that I wanted to talk about with Denning is this idea of that managerial action is less effective than we realize. And how does that relate to me having to give a eulogy? Well, I didn't want the eulogy to be something where I just got up there and it was my experience with my father, this is who he was to me. And just everybody here, all 300 people plus whatever, just accept it because it's my moment. I didn't want it to be that. And sometimes it can become that at funerals. And, if you're someone that's only somewhat familiar with the person being honored, then it might not relate to you. And I wanted to make sure that if someone took the time to come out, to be there, to be present at my father's funeral, that they felt connected to the stories being told. So that's how that kind of ties in. It's this idea that it's not about just, well, you're going to listen to me because I'm the person that's on the stage and has the mic right now. Or I didn't want it to be separate. I didn't want to be separated like, well, I'm the one giving the eulogy, so here you go. I wanted to make sure that people felt included, that they felt tied into that. The second thing is that I had to deal with this idea that my audience was very difficult to relate to for me. So again, a little bit of background about my dad. So he actually was a captain in the Air Force during the Vietnam War. He was stationed in Saigon. He died from Parkinson's disease that was a result of his exposure to Agent Orange while stationed in Saigon. He was a Bronze Star awardee, and it was just something that he never discussed with me. It was not a part of his life that I knew, but after talking to my family, I knew that I had to address it in some way because it was what shaped him into this great man that he was. It was his time in the military that he found himself. And I know that there's a lot of people in this class in particular that could probably relate to that. The idea that the military gave him a sense of pride and a sense of accomplishment. So I knew that there would be people that would know that part of my father's life, that there would be officers that worked with him or, were over him, and that there would be people who served under him at some point that might show up. So I made sure that I incorporated something from that. Also, my father worked for a company called DuPont, which those of you out in Texas might not be familiar with, but it's one of the biggest companies in the world. So my dad worked for them for about 30 years and is considered one of the founding members of the information technology, I guess, global department for DuPont. And he worked with people from all over the place. I think we counted, and he had been to something like 30 plus countries just in his career. So I knew that there would be people from different cultures that knew my dad in a different way than I would ever experience him. And I had to address that. And then, of course, my family and our church friends. And there would just, the list goes on and on and on. So, again, the old school way of thinking would be, well, the people that are going to show up are going to be the people like my dad. But that's not necessarily true, because everybody in that room experienced my father in a different way. And I had to, in some way, honor that. The final point that Denning makes that I want to address is this idea that leaders must understand the audience's story. And that's where I'm going to stay for the next minute or two. Like I said, I didn't want to just make it, here's my father-son story. I wanted to honor the fact that I was speaking not just for myself, but I was speaking for everybody in that room to honor my father. And so what I did was, Denning talks about how if you're going to try and guide people through change, that the best way to do that is to listen to their stories, to understand where they're coming from. And if you're going to set this goal for them, figure out how their background might influence their ability to reach that goal. Mastering the audience's story, essentially. And that's what I needed to do. I needed to listen. And that's what I did for 2 or 3 days. All I did was read emails, make phone calls, talk to people in person, and just listen to their stories about my father. I tried to reach people from his work, his military service, from his childhood, parts of his life that I just didn't know. And it came back that, I established a common theme about my father. And that was that he was this man of compassion, that he was this servant leader. He was this man who people loved to work for. They loved to serve under. They, loved having him as a sibling, as an uncle, as a, whatever. Because of this compassion that he showed. And that's what I went with. I went with, this is a common theme. This is something that I can tell any story about him being this, and it's going to relate to everybody. Again, it might be a little bit of a stretch, but it's my reality right now. It's what I'm dealing with, and it's what I'm coping with, and it's how I was able to relate the eulogy to everybody that was in that room. And it was by mastering the audience's story, by listening to who they were, how they had experienced my father's life, and tying it all together into one big story, one big narrative. And Denning ends by saying that it's through stories that we really learn about people. And I think that's one of the best ways that I could have honored my father, was to tell a story about how he was this servant leader, this man of compassion, who cared about those around him. And again, it was really reading this chapter in particular that helped me establish that and understand that that's what I needed to do, that I needed to listen, that even though I was going to be the one on the stage speaking and leading people to this goal of honoring my father, that in order to do that properly, I needed to know who my audience was going to be. And I think I accomplished that. So thanks for listening, and I hope that in some way this helped you guys process this chapter a little bit more clearly, or maybe even just see it from a different perspective, through a different lens. So appreciate your time. Thanks for listening.